Be seated. So let's continue our look at the history of our Bible, and we have reached the point of looking now at the modern English Bible. We had the King James Bible that came about 1611, and as it came about, we looked some about how the different processes were done, and it really helps us to know how a translation ought to be made. And then a lot of translations have come out in the past more or less 140 years. And so in English. This is just a listing of some of them. This is not comprehensive at all. You could actually have a list twice this long if you wanted to have the more recent ones from 1950 forward, the last 70 years. It's amazing how many have come out. So when we think about these, let's think about how we ought to consider a translation. And when we think about a translation, one, you want to know, what did they translate from? And so we will be looking a little bit at the Living Bible. And the Living Bible was a translation in a way, but it wasn't a translation from Greek and Hebrew. They actually used a previous English translation, and then somebody put the English into their own words. And so it was not technically a translation, it is what we call a paraphrase. So they simply took English and rephrased it. And so they phrased it like this. And so that is a paraphrase. So you want to know what the foundation is. And they could use something in the foundation that may not be the best scholarship on the Greek or the Hebrew text. Well, you don't want that. You want the best scholarship possible on the underlying text. And so, for example, there are some that were made quite a while back, not the more recent ones, and they were based on the Latin Vulgate. Well, that's not what you want, because it was written in Greek and Hebrew. So you want it based on the Greek and the Hebrew. You also want to know who makes up the committee. Because if it's just one person, you want to know that. Because then you've got a bigger chance of the bias of that person coming through in the translation. You also want to know what groups did they belong to. Because if it's all from a single group, they're probably going to favor that type of theology. One of the complaints on the Jehovah's Witness translation is that they were all so convinced of the Jehovah's Witness doctrines that their translations came out favoring those doctrines. And so they would come out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. A God. And there is not a single Jewish person alive in the first century who would have been willing to say a God, much less a Jewish Christian writer like John. There's not a ghost of a chance John would have written a God. If he did, he would have been betraying everything he believed in on monotheism, one God only. You better know who the committee was. You want to know what the type of translation is. There are two sort of extremes, and most of them fall in between. You could do what we call an interlinear. Now that's a word for word, but it won't make sense to you when you see it necessarily in your language, because it's going to follow the language exactly of the base text. And that language may or may not work in your language. There may be words that they can assume that don't work to be assumed in English. And so that's where you want to know, how are they translating it? We also have some that go all the way to the other extreme. And they translate it in such a way that they totally move the settings. And so all of a sudden, Jesus is going from Macon up to Atlanta in Georgia. Wait a minute. That's a long way from Israel. So that's where you have someone, Cotton Patch version, and he simply puts the entire story into the Deep South. And so it's a Georgia, Alabama type story. And that's where you've got a radical translation method. Normally what we do is we have two well-accepted options. One we call a formal equivalency. The other is what we call a functional equivalency. Some will say dynamic equivalency. Technically, it's called a functional equivalency. What that means is formal means you're going to be very formal on looking at the foundational language, Greek, Hebrew, and you're going to translate it, and you're going to see a lot of that language come through, and you're not going to vary it any more than necessary to communicate the meaning. We tend to think of that as more of a word-for-word translation. It's not technically word for word, but it's trying to keep the formal aspects of the original language in place. A functional equivalency translation takes what's being said, but will phrase it in the modern language to where it's more of a phrase-oriented translation versus words. And so the flow is better in the modern language than the word for word. For study purposes, guess which one works better? The word for word. Functional equivalency. For understanding it by just general reading, guess which one works better? The functional equivalency. And so you got word for word on the formal, you've got good reading ability on the functional side, phrasing, words, and our translations go across that scope. Now, it's not two fixed points. It's like a line, and they're somewhere along that spectrum. Most of them aren't on those extremes we mentioned earlier. So you need to know what type of translation. And the type of translation a lot of times is tied up with the intended use of the translation. How many of you ever heard of Good News for Modern Man? Yep, the Good News Bible. It was real popular. It got very popular during the Billy Graham Crusades when he promoted it. And it actually came out of Argentina, not English. And it was an evangelistic tool for reaching people in Argentina. It was a phrase-oriented, I'm just going to say word-oriented, phrase-oriented. It was a phrase-oriented translation, and it was super easy to read. Real easy to read. And they even had these little stick figures in it. They had very basic artwork, let's just say. So you got to know what the intended use is. Some translations are intended to be intense study type translations. Some are intended to be more of a reader's translation. Some try to go in between those and try to hit both. So you need to know also what the style of the language is. What is the language and the style they're going to use? Some will aim for a low readability level to where you don't need as much education to understand the vocabulary. And some will say, we're not going to worry about the reader level, we're going to worry about some of the translation issues, and the readability might go up. Do you realize the King James Version now is rated somewhere around second year of college on being able to understand the vocabulary and the style? In other words, not somebody that's used to it. If you're taking a young person growing up today, they're going to need about 2 years of college to really fully be able to understand the language in the King James Version. So the King James Bible needs a lot because their language and style is outdated, and so now we don't understand some of the terms. And so when you read in James about people putting on their gay apparel, it doesn't work anymore because that ain't our language. And you better have enough education to understand that term used to not mean what it means now. And so that was Flintstones, actually. But in James, they used the term gay as well. But it has nothing to do with lifestyles. What about doctrinal tendencies? And some of them will intentionally steer you one direction or the other. We jokingly call the ESV the Eternal Security Version. And because some feel like it's got a little bit of a Calvinist drift to it. Well, where is the doctrinal focus at? So, And then you ought to check some passages. So how did the Bible come to us? Well, let's back up, and then we're going to go forward again on the translations. The Bible comes into the U.S., and everything's being printed in Europe. Okay, so we really don't have Bibles being printed in the U.S. until 1782. And that's the first printing of a Bible in America. That's pretty amazing. In 1808, Robert Aiken's daughter, he had passed away, inherits his printing press, and she is the first woman to ever print a Bible. We have a copy of that Bible, an original, not a made copy. We have an original of that Bible in the Bible Museum in New Orleans. And but she is the first woman known to have ever printed a Bible. Pretty amazing. We then have, in the late 1800s, a major revision that's going to be made to the King James Version. And so the KJV, we'll just say KJV, King James Version. The King James is revised, but here's what's different. It had been revised in 1861 on language and other things. It had been revised multiple times. But this time, they're actually going to revise the translation, not just the language. And that's a big difference. So they're going to reevaluate the entire translation foundation and what's going to come out in the translation. That's the first major English translation since the King James Version in 1611. It's been revised, but there hasn't been a major new English translation. There have been some minor ones, but nothing that really caught fire, had a lot of backing behind it. There'd been an individual or two that had done some things. But this was a major Protestant effort to make a new translation modeled on the King James. So it's the heritage of the King James, but with the new work coming into play. We usually see that as a major new translation. That is called the English Revised Version. And then the American one comes out because we're going to make our own, because our language is a little different from those blokes over there who speak just a little different than we do. And so we go ahead and we make our own translation. The American Standard Version, 1901, it comes out. And there are some differences. And it's not just spelling, because we spell some things differently, even though it's the same word. But it's not the text that's so different on the foundation, it's the wording of the English that's different. Those are the two big moves that are made prior to the middle of the 1900s. Then we're going to go forward from there. So now we're going to back up to this one, and we're going to look at a few of these. And what I'm going to do is make this a little larger for you on the screen now that I'm not jumping from screen to screen. And so these are some of the ones we're going to look at. And I've got them simply in the order to where I think some of the ones you'll be most interested in will mix in so that you don't sort of get lost along the way. The chronological order is what you're seeing right now, because they made that English Revised Version, and then they decided to make the Revised Standard Version. And that is a revision of the one from the late 1800s. And so they revise it and update it. That's actually done in 1948. They do not include the Apocrypha, so it is not acceptable for non-Protestant groups, by and large, meaning Orthodox and Catholics. But they have a separate group that decides to do the Apocrypha and add it in. The reason they didn't include the Apocrypha is that the Bible societies had a policy that they would not print the Apocrypha. Point blank policy, that's it. But if they're going to get this accepted by all groups, they got to include the Apocrypha. So they made it in two different options, with or without the Apocrypha. With the Apocrypha, it will not be printed by the Bible societies. Without the Apocrypha, the Bible societies print it and spread it around as well. If I remember right, it's about 1952 when the Apocrypha part comes out as well. And Bruce Metzger is a leading figure on that. And he actually becomes a leading figure on the next revision of it. So let's follow that one through briefly. And as we look at that one, let me see if I get the right place. Then we get this one changed. And in 1990, they revise it again. And so just rounding it off because of the Apocrypha issue, let's just say 1950. We'll subtract a couple of years. Now we're going to go 40 years more, and it gets another major revision. Here's the big difference. This is by the Bible Societies on both of these. And so the United Bible Societies is underwriting the translation. This time, things have changed even more. And they decide to directly involve some of the Eastern Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox especially. There's a person that became a leading Bible scholar there, and he becomes part of the larger committee. They include them to where it will be approved, and it's the first major English translation to be approved by virtually every Christian group around that's not super deviant. There are some deviant groups that won't approve anything but just this translation or that, their own normally. But this becomes the first Bible that really has full approval across the board by everybody. It's not liked by everybody, but it is approved for use by everybody. And so it does become a major translation. It is still a major translation in most of what we call mainline Protestant churches, meaning what? Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist, Episcopalian. I'm missing one. Those are the mainline Protestant groups, though. And I can't remember the other one I'm missing, but at any rate, those are the main ones where this translation, even today, will be the standard when you go into their churches. So, it is not the standard in evangelical settings. So that's why, how many of you have ever even read one of those? The reason it's not so common in evangelical settings is that some felt like they broadened the tent so much to reach everybody that they lost some focuses that they thought they ought to be keeping in the translation. And so that's part of what we have to look at on this. Okay, so now let's back up. That's the heritage of the King James. That heritage will try to be carried out a little further, but that's where most of it goes. Now let's look at some of the ones that try to do some other types of things. The Amplified Bible. How many of you have ever heard of the Amplified Bible? All right. The New Testament comes out pretty early, but the full Bible is by 1987. This is actually being updated as well. And there's an update out for some of it, not all of it. I don't think the full one's out. It might have just come out. But even so, what this does is when you hit a certain place and the options are there on how you're going to translate it, it just gives you 2 or 3 options. And it doesn't give you just a translation. It lets you know, and you could translate it this way or that way. And so it just gives you a parenthesis with some other options on words for the translation. It actually, in a sense, is building in a study option for you into the text. And so it's a very good way of studying the text. The problem is, who is going to be most qualified to pick which of those options is probably most accurate? That's where the problem comes in on this one. Because when they simply give you the options, now let's just check and see. Pastor Chip doesn't get a voice. No, he can vote too. How many of y'all here are really good at Hebrew, and if you see several options, you know from your Hebrew which one you ought to pick? You're Hebrew, you got it. How many of you on your Greek, you're so good on your Greek, when you see options, you know, that's not what the Greek says. It ought to mean this. The negative part of the Amplified Bible is that it puts the choice on you But isn't that why you wanted someone to do the translation to start with? Didn't you want them to translate it because they knew the languages and they're supposed to get you the most accurate translation? And so what happens is people pick not based on what's the most likely translation. They pick the options based on what they like the most. And so when you read the three options, maybe you say, oh, I like this option. Maybe that was a 10% chance, and one of the others was an 80% chance of being right. And so all of a sudden you're going to build your reading of the text on you making choices based on just what you like, not what's the best translation. That's the weak point of the Amplified Bible, is that it actually makes you make choices that the translators probably should have made for you. The strength is, but you see the places where there are some options. Now, if you'll do your homework, there are some Bible study books that are word studies, and they would actually clarify some of this for you. But what that means is you're going to have to get some more study tools beyond just the Bible. And then the Amplified Bible actually may become a good key to where it tells you, okay, this is pretty clear, this is pretty clear, this is pretty clear. Now you got three options. I better look up this passage at this place. This is where I need to double check something. This is clear, clear, clear. Wait, here are three more options. I better check this part of the passage. So it lets you know where you might want to do some checking on how the translation is being done. And so it's got a lot of strengths. It's got a weakness as well. Most of them will do that. So another one that, this is one, a few of these are ones I don't think most of you are using. So we're going to go over those fairly quickly, actually. The CEV, Contemporary English Version. This one also was made by the United Bible Societies. It is the heir of the Good News, so to speak. And so this is like an updated Good News, but a brand new translation. When it first came out, they were claiming it was on about a fourth grade level. About a fourth grade level. Now they bump it up a little bit, but it is super easy to read. And its purpose, what was the purpose of the Good News Bible? We talked about it. It came out of Argentina, and the purpose was for evangelism. Evangelism. That's what the Good News Bible was created for. This one has the same purpose. It's a great evangelistic Bible because it is easy reading. The problem is it is so easy on the reading that they use some slang terms to where I would never use this translation from the pulpit for the Old Testament. It's too blunt. It's just too blunt about things. And so when it talks about certain sexual issues, it just uses whatever is the common language of the time. That's not how we talk about things in church. And so that's where it's good for you on your personal reading. I do not recommend this for church reading. And now some of y'all going to go look it up because I want to see what it says. No, it's not crude in the sense of being out of bounds, but it is crude in the sense of the terms they pick are not church terms, let's just say, okay? And so, and everybody's going to read it, and you're going to know exactly what it's saying. There's no question about it. It's just we don't say it that way in church. There are other ways of saying it that are a lot nicer when you have mixed genders in the setting. So, there's another one that has become pretty common. Well, I'm sorry, I got one out of order there. The Good News, we already talked about. It was fully finished, old and new, in 1976. And then we get the revision, and that ends up coming out in the other, okay? We have one called God's Word Bible. This is primarily an Lutheran item in the Evangelical, and it's a very it's a very meaning-oriented translation, not word for word so much, but it's fairly good there. But it's got a lot of contemporary. It never caught on. Okay, and this one really didn't get a lot of press. And if you find a copy, get one, because I wouldn't mind having one for our Bible museum, because I think we got one copy in the library maybe. That's about it. And so we don't have much on that at all. Let's back up a minute on mine, not yours. One that has caught on is the English Standard Version, ESV. This was one made primarily in the late 90s. Publication comes after all the translation work is done. I know some of the ones who worked on this one. It was made to be somewhat of the evangelical counterpoint to the New Revised Standard Version. And so they said, we need one also that is up to date, very accepted, founded on the best Greek and Hebrew text. And the new RSV has a stellar record on the scholarship of what it's founded on. And we want it to be such that it is more acceptable in the evangelical setting. And so the ESV, we call it, comes out. It's a real solid translation. It has gained a lot of traction, especially as we have a lot of groups that aren't old-style Calvinistic, but they're sort of new-style Calvinistic. That means they're somewhat Calvinistic, not real far over necessarily. And that's where it gets its moniker, the Eternal Security Version, okay? Because it does seem to have a little bit of a Calvinistic focus on some of the points on the translation. Is it enough to where anybody could say this is too slanted to use? Not at all. Is it enough to where if you really know what you're looking for, you would say, oh, they made a bad choice here, bad choice there. If you really know what you're looking for, you could find it. If you don't know what you're looking for, you will never notice it. And so I've seen people use it. I've read it. And if you're not really watching for it, it's going to be a great translation for you. And you will not be led off track by it. But the criticism was there. All right. Well, Catholics weren't just sitting by doing nothing. They were also working along the way. And as they were working, they came up, there it is, with the New American Bible. And this was one of the first editions for the Catholic Church based upon the Greek and Hebrew with virtually no Vulgate influence. Now, they had made one earlier. They'd made an earlier translation. Back in the 40s, they made one, and it was a much better translation. But after Vatican II, with the Catholic Church shifting away from Latin, now it was a great moment for them to seal Vatican II by coming out with a new English translation that was based on the Greek and the Hebrew. And that's what they did. And this is the New American Bible. For Catholics to use a Bible, it must include the Apocrypha. That is simply part of the Catholic outlook. You will not get the stamp of approval, the imprimatur of the Vatican, without that happening. This has that. Many of these Bibles now have that if they include the Apocrypha. Well, that needed to be updated, and so sure enough, they have updated it along the way. And the updated one came out in the 90s, and I don't think I don't actually have that one listed here. So, okay. We also have one that is pretty popular, and this came out first as the American Standard, New American Standard Bible, NASB. It actually comes out originally as a reaction to the Revised Standard Version, because a lot of evangelicals reacted to that translation from back around 1950. And the reason they reacted is that now we're at a point where Protestants are really divided more and more between evangelicals and mainline Protestants. And you're starting to get some theological battles taking place. And some of these battles get reflected in Bible translations, unfortunately. Sometimes it's legitimate battles, sometimes it's perceived battles. This one was mostly a perceived battle. But it still becomes a battle as soon as somebody starts highlighting it. And so in the book of Isaiah, Well, first let's go to Matthew. In Matthew, we have a prophecy about Jesus' birth based on Isaiah. And that prophecy says in Matthew, no question about it, and a virgin will conceive. Okay. And we have the fulfillment in Mary. And so we have a miraculous birth for Jesus. But in Isaiah, the word is actually young maiden. But prior English translations had still used the word virgin for the Isaiah passage, even though it wasn't required by the Hebrew text. Well, the Revised Standard Version decided to go with the Hebrew on a more literal level, and they said a young maiden will conceive. And the reason is there's actually a child born in Isaiah. And they didn't want to give the impression that there are two virgin births, one in Isaiah's time and one with Jesus. And they also wanted to be literal with the text, and it actually says a young maiden will conceive. Well, there was a lot of reaction to that it was the beginning of a denial of the virgin birth of Jesus. This translation is part of that backlash. It is one that's brought out, and it is funded by the Lockman Foundation. They do not use the best Greek text, but they use a very solid Greek text. And so they make a new translation, and it is a word-for-word study Bible. If you have this, you probably have the New American Standard Bible 95 update if you have a copy, because they updated it in 95. There's a brand new update, should be out within the next 2 years. They pretty much finished all the work on it, and so they'll be getting that into publication. It'll be an update from the 95 edition, and so they're going to continually be updating it. It is one of the most respected study Bibles in the English language today among evangelicals. This translation has not gained much ground among the mainline Protestants, but among evangelicals it's got quite a good reception. When we go forward on this, we also find what has become a little bit of an awkward setting, the New King James Version. Here's the problem. It's actually more of a new translation in a lot of ways, but they came up with the name. They weren't going to name it this, but it was a marketing coup, because most people literally think this is just an updated King James. But it's more than just an updated King James. And it has become somewhere, it's within the top 5 top-selling Bible translations in English. It has been as high as number 3 on English sales of Bibles. Good translation, still retains the textual foundations pretty much of the King James. So you're still limited on the Greek and Hebrew text that they use on their foundation. Another one that's pretty well used is the New Living Bible. The New Living Translation. Living Bible was a paraphrase. One guy did it. And when Kenneth Taylor did it, he was making a Bible that'd be understandable to people in the 60s. And it was. It was actually a wonderful, readable Bible. A lot of us got copies of the Living Bible. And I know it was one of the first Bibles that I read, and it made sense to me. And years before, I had been given a King James Bible by my grandparents, and I struggled and struggled to read it, and I don't even know if I ever made it out of Genesis. But at any rate, this one was really readable. But it was one person making a paraphrase of an English translation. It was so well liked, they decided, let's make it a real translation. And they decided to translate it from the Greek and Hebrew, and this is a full, legitimate translation now, using the translation practices of the Living Bible to make it very understandable, but making it solid by making it a full translation from the Greek and the Hebrew. And now let's go to the one that's probably best known by a lot of you. The NIV, the New International Version. This also is a major evangelical undertaking. It as well is a little bit of a backlash to try to find a Bible that evangelicals like more. It's not as much of a backlash against the Revised Standard Version, but it is somewhat of one. But they do a good job on making a full translation from the Greek and the Hebrew, and for quite some time, this has now become the number one selling Bible in the English language. It passed up the King James back in the 90s and has not really relinquished that role, even though there's some getting closer. King James slowly moves down, but the King James is still in either the second place or third place year after year on the top-selling English Bibles. And so you still see huge sales there. But the NIV tends to be the number one selling English translation. It is very readable. They're the first ones that made a major translation using what's called dynamic equivalency or functional equivalency. And they made a very readable Bible that was solid enough to use for Bible study as well. And so you could both study the Bible from it and read it and understand it easily. That was the beauty of the New International Version. They have made multiple revisions. Some of those revisions have not been as well received. And the reason is, on some of their revisions, they decided that they needed to update some of the language. And so we come up with today's New International Version, 2002, and they change about 7% of the text because they have decided they're going to make it a gender-accurate version. Critics say gender-neutral. They would say gender-accurate. But there are political battles going on in the theological world at that point in time about gender issues. And it hits the market as picking sides in gender debates. And as it's tagged as picking one side versus the other in the gender debates, major groups say they will not use this Bible. Southern Baptist was one of those groups. We actually had a convention vote not to accept this translation. That was pretty strong. Now that's changed, okay? So that's not on the record anymore, but it was for a time. Part of their changes would be sons of God becomes children of God. Man becomes a person when the context implies it's not just a male. The trouble is, man used to be generic. And in English usage, you could say mankind, and you weren't talking about males. You didn't have to say humankind, womankind. Mankind was generic. And so a lot of the translations used man in a generic sense. They went back and made the generic ones not be so gender focused. When it was plural, they changed it a lot of times and to make sure that it had come into play in the right way. So, when John talks about the Jews, they say the Jews there in the setting of the context where the events are taking place. That it's not anti-Semitic for all Jews of all time, but those Jews in the context where John is speaking. And they're trying to avoid bad interpretations that come out of it. So, now they have revised that, and everybody is fairly happy with how the revision has come about. We also have one called The Message. And The Message is pretty popular in some settings. It's not as good a translation because it relies on a single person, but it's still very, very readable. I suspect before long somebody will decide we're going to make this a good translation. So, how many English translations do we need? Now we're reaching the point to where we legitimately need to ask, have we gone into overdrive and produced too many English translations? But we're not going to cover that tonight. We're going to wrap this series up next week, looking at a few more translations and the issue of then how do you pick a good translation? Because that's what you need to know about. So let's close with a word of prayer, and then we're going to leave a few minutes for some questions. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for all the effort, the sacrifice has gone into bringing the Bible to us. For all those who have dedicated their lives on translating the Bible, many times literally giving their lives for that to happen. Help us to appreciate your word, to apply it to our lives, to let you use it to mold and shape us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.